I'll now run quickly through the impact of yesterday's announcements on public services. I want to focus first on the short term. I'll turn to the medium term picture after that. There was really two budgets yesterday, one for the next few years and one for after the next election. So the starting point for the short-term outlook is that at last year's spending review held last October, the government set out 3 years of detailed department by department funding settlements. Those run for the 3 years up until 2024-25. Now they're fixed in cash terms. That means they don't automatically adjust if inflation or pay awards differ from what was initially assumed. The cash budget has to take that into account. Now, despite what we might have expected and given what's happening to headline consumer inflation, the overall generosity of those plans hasn't actually shifted much on paper. So just to illustrate that, if we look on the left-hand side here, I'm going to show you average real terms growth over the 5-year parliament. The green bar is what was planned for at the last year's spending review. The blue bar is what is now implied based on yesterday's plans for overall day-to-day departmental spending. So stripping out investment, this is for spending on things like staff and day-to-day running costs. You can see very similar. And if we just look at the 3 years covered by the spending review period, again, very, very similar, if anything, a slightly faster growth rate. Now, that's puzzling given what we keep hearing about, including our own publications talking about inflation eating away at the generosity of departmental budgets. So what's going on? Well, there's a few things. First of all, the measure of inflation that we typically use for such calculations is called the GDP deflator. It's a measure of economy-wide domestic inflation. That's going to be higher in the short term, but not that much higher, and actually is forecast by the OBR to be lower in the medium term. So let me show you that. Green bars here show you the annual forecast inflation as per this measure last October. Yellow bars show you March, and the blue bars show you as of yesterday. So you can see the blue bars there, GDP deflator inflation spiking up to almost 5% this year. Now that's well below CPI, which is running at more like double that rate, and about 3% next year. Then you can see on the right-hand side, it falling back and actually being lower than what was previously forecast. And lower inflation means a given level of cash increases equates to a faster real terms growth rate. So in the short term, why is it so perhaps unexpectedly low? Well, it's being held down by the fact that import prices are growing much faster than export prices. Much of the inflation we're facing in the UK is driven by rising costs of imported food and imported energy and imported fuel. Because the GDP deflator measures domestic inflation, those don't feature. And there's also some impacts from unwinding lockdown effects on public services. Then in the medium term, weak consumer price inflation and consumer demand combined with slower growth in the government part of consumption holds that down. And that's why you've got this very low, below 1% rate of inflation in the later years of the forecast. So those lower rates of inflation flatter the real terms growth in the government spending plans. There are very good reasons to think that that measure of inflation, while perhaps the best one we have, isn't going to perfectly capture cost pressures on public services. There are particular challenges around pay awards. So the GDP deflator next year is expected to be about 3%, CPI about 5.5%. So if government departments offer inflation matching pay award to their workers, that's clearly going to exceed the cost pressures that would be suggested if you just looked at the GDP deflator. And pay is going to be a very difficult policy area. It's extremely hard to see how you could have pay awards matching inflation or indeed real terms pay rises for public sector workers over the next few years without either cutting back on headcount or cutting back severely on some other area that will determine service quality. There was also some extra money yesterday. There was extra money for the NHS and for schools, a couple of billion each. And there was quite a bit of extra money for local government. And it's not very often we get to say this at these post-budget events, but local government was actually a particular winner with more money from grants, being allowed to raise more in council tax, some compensation for business rates indexation change, and also reallocating some funding that was previously earmarked to implement the social care funding reforms, which, as Paul said, been delayed and might eventually get canned entirely, but that frees up money that can be spent on other things. So councils, particularly those with social care responsibilities, did fairly well out of yesterday's announcements. Other less fortunate budgets will instead be left facing a squeeze from inflation. The OBR estimate that squeeze might be between 5 and 15 billion over the spending review period, depending on how you measure it. That's clearly going to be very difficult for other budgets to absorb. There's also a final thing, which is that big underspends last year by departments lower the starting point, they lower the baseline, so increases relative to a lower baseline, those percentages look larger. So altogether, the overall generosity on paper hasn't changed much. Pay decisions look very difficult. There might be good reasons to think that the actual cost pressures are a bit greater than is suggested by the official figures. And if you're not schools, local government, or the NHS, you're being asked to squeeze your budget, and that's going to be painful. Then after 2025, there were some cuts to the government's plans for spending. So that you can see that here. You can see on the left-hand side, the extra money there for the NHS and social care and schools, but you can see on the right-hand side, reductions in planned spending. Now you can see the yellow bar there is the cut in what was penciled in for aid spending. The government originally was planning for aid to return to 0.7% of GDP. It will now be held at 0.5% of GDP. One quirk yesterday was while the Chancellor dropped and changed his headline fiscal rules, he left his original fiscal rules as the thing that will determine when aid goes back to 0.7% of national income. We still have to be running a current budget surplus for that to happen, which is not expected to happen over the entire forecast period. So how did they manage that? Well, they actually just basically tweaked the spending assumption that is applied beyond 2025. So previously, average day-to-day departmental funding was set to grow by more than 3% per year above inflation. That's now 1%. But a 1% increase on average, when combined with increases for some areas, is probably going to mean cuts for other less fortunate, what we might call unprotected budgets. So the OBR provided some useful analysis of this yesterday. They showed that if the overall day-to-day budget rises by 1% per year, you give the NHS 3.1%, which is what it was intended to get over the this 5-year parliament. You keep per pupil funding in schools flat, but because pupil numbers are set to fall, it means you could reduce overall school spending by a bit. You hold defence and aid spending constant as a fraction of national income. You're left, look at that red bar, cutting everything else by about 0.7% per year if you want to stay within those plans. So that's one reasonable guess or estimate of what those plans might imply for public services. Now, that's not the only one. We can consider alternative scenarios, in particular scenarios where the government provides extra funding. So let's consider a different set of assumptions. Maybe the NHS grows at more like its long-run average rate, so more like 3.8% rather than 3.1%. Perhaps that would better allow the NHS to deal with the substantial pandemic pressures, post-pandemic pressures it's facing, the number of COVID patients it has, the scale of waiting lists, for example, and to put in place a long-term workforce plan and maybe offer some slightly more generous pay awards. Let's assume that overall schools funding remains flat. So rather than falling in line with pupil numbers, you've still got to have the same number of classrooms and schools in the short term. So it might be difficult to cut spending. Defence, let's instead assume that it rises towards 2.5% of GDP. That's more in line with what Boris Johnson and Liz Truss had committed to, and actually more in line with what Jeremy Hunt promised when he was running to be Prime Minister a few short years ago. And if we hold aid constant as a fraction of national income and freeze everything else, avoid making cuts, well, you'd have to find about £17 billion extra by the end of the period. If you didn't find 17 billion extra and you wanted to do all those things, you'd have to cut those unprotected budgets by about 3% per year. Now, £17 billion in the scale of some of the huge numbers Carl was talking about isn't enormous. It's well within the realms of possibility. It's also roughly what recent experience might suggest is likely. So if we look at the last 4 spending reviews, and we look at these provisional spending totals that were penciled in by various chancellors, And then we look at what actually happened when they came to holding a spending review, allocating it between departments, making those actual tough decisions about where the cuts are going to fall. Well, they always ended up getting topped up. So you can see top up varies in scale, but on average, the final year of these provisional plans gets topped up by about 3.7%. If history repeats itself, that will be about £18 billion extra by the end of the period, very similar to the 17 billion I showed you on the previous slide. So you might think of that as a sort of reasonable estimate of what might get added to spending plans. And that combined with, for example, freezing fuel duty would take the Chancellor further away from delivering on his fiscal objectives. Now, turning to capital or investment spending, again, it was a sort of a game of two halves. In the short term, the Chancellor stuck to his existing plans, but then after 2025, he penciled in a cash terms freeze. Now, a cash terms freeze, when inflation is positive and rising, and when the economy is growing, means that investment will fall in real terms and fall as a fraction of national income. So showing here how public sector investment has evolved over time and what it looks like over the forecast period, you can see that it's set to be still above where it's been for most of the past 40 years, still above 2% of GDP, though you can see lower than it would have been under pre-autumn statement plans, about 15 billion lower in the final year. The challenge is that the Chancellor has said his three priorities will be energy, innovation and infrastructure. But if you protect those budgets, if you protect, for example, investments in energy infrastructure and research funding and transport and digital, because those things are all important, well, if overall spending is falling, does that mean a squeeze on other things? Does that mean, for example, a squeeze on the capital budget for the NHS or the prison system or the further education system? There might still be difficult choices to be made here, even though overall investment spending will remain at what is a fairly high level, at least by UK standards. So to sum up, there's some extra money in the short term for schools, NHS and local governments. That undoubtedly will be welcome. Other less fortunate public services will have to absorb cost pressures from higher inflation. There will still be some very difficult choices about public sector pay. Sticking to those cash spending plans for the next few years is very difficult to see how that's consistent with inflation matching pay awards. There could be another round of potential real terms pay cuts for public sector workers, and potentially a round of strikes in response. It's also worth saying that there might be more money available for things like the NHS, but there's still a potential disconnect between the funding available and what they're being asked to deliver. The extra cash for the NHS, for example, came with a list of additional asks in terms of what it's going to do about ambulance waiting times and urgent care and things like that. And so there's a danger here, particularly with the substantial cost pressures departments are facing, is that the funding available isn't enough still to deliver on the government's public service objectives. And after 2025, the plans look, in our judgment, implausibly tight. The hope is clearly that they'll never have to be implemented, or at least someone else will have to implement them. And that has to cast some doubt on the credibility of the overall public finance forecasts. That's all from me. Thanks very much.